Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Breidenbach, and I am the Executive Director for the Institute. This is the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. So you can find us at genealogicalstudies.com. And we have a very special presenter today. She is a lecture student with the Institute. Her name is Denise Shoulders. She's going to present to us today on poking holes in family lore. At the end of this presentation, you'll have the opportunity to give us your opinion of how her lecture went. We will present 7 questions, and you as an attendee will be able to answer those questions, and that will go toward her grade. So we hope you enjoy this presentation. And I'm now going to tell you a little bit about Denise Shoulders. She's a BCG certified genealogist, professional and genetic genealogist. She's at a Logan County Genealogical Society president as well. And she belongs to the Russellville chapter DAR, and she's their registrar. Denise Shoulders has 30 years research experience in the US and internationally. She holds certified credentials from the Board for Certification of Genealogists and has lectured on various genealogically relevant topics for almost 20 years. Poking Holes in Family Lore, a case study in uncovering the truth. Every story has a bit of truth to it, even in family history. How do you separate the facts from embellishments? Using a real example from my research. And I'll show you how I poked holes in my family narrative to get the truth. This is her description for what she's going to present to you today. And as she goes through this, she's going to give you some resources and some wonderful opportunities to use this to do your own genealogy research. Denise, would you go ahead and take it away?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for silencing your microphones and for attending tonight's presentation. I want to talk with you about the family stories you uncover while researching. Some of them may be old family tales passed through many generations of your family. Others may be uncovered and new to you as you research your family, the stories you've never heard before. No matter the case, you should try to research the story just as thoroughly as you do the individuals in your family tree. When you research the story, you're not trying to add to the story. Instead, you're trying to find evidence that supports the story you've always heard. Researching the story also gives the storyteller credibility. In this presentation, we'll talk about asking the right questions, identifying the facts, thinking about where to find the records to support the story, and we'll review the information to determine as best as possible what's the truth, what's a lie, and what's plausible. When you begin researching your family's stories, ask yourself, what is the narrative? Or maybe your question is, which story am I focusing on with this search? Write it down or type it out. Make sure to include every detail according to each person who has told the story. Identify who says which parts that differ. Their perspective or knowledge of the situation may explain why their version is different from all the others. Omitting a version may be the one version that has more truth to it than any other. Now that you have the story you're focusing on, ask yourself, what are the facts? Identify the facts and nothing but the facts. Identify details in the story that can be proven or disproven and write them down. These facts will become your research plan. I have learned if I try to disprove a fact, more often than not, I end up proving it instead. Identify the records you need to look for, sources to consult, where these sources may be located, and when necessary, historical context of any details in the story. Think about record creation, availability, and access. Do the facts include births, marriages, divorces, or deaths? Where were those records created and where are they held now? Do the facts include residences? Will city directories or census records help? Where will you find these records? Are there details in the story that can be verified through historical context? Does your story mention connections to events such as the Gold Rush, the Pony Express, a war or specific battle, or to the beginning of a settled area or town? Can you prove or disprove these mentions with other available historical data? A word of caution. When researching, avoid information bias. Are you sure your family has always been dirt poor farmers, so you think you don't need to search land records? Are you sure your family has never owned anything that might be worth suing them over, so you don't look at court cases? Are you sure your family has always been in this country, so you don't need to search for immigration records or ship manifests? Are you sure your family never enslaved others, so you don't look at those records that would reveal this information? Try not to assume what you have always been told or what your family thinks they've always known has always been the case. Doing so may misguide you and steer you away from the records that hold the answers or clues you need. Now, before I go further, I do want you to know that the story I'm about to share has been passed through my family and that all individuals directly involved have passed away. Family dysfunction and disconnect created from the events covered in this presentation continues today. The men shown here are 5 out of 12 children born to my great-grandparents, Parker William Lewis, a Canadian immigrant, and Florence Edith Jane, an English immigrant, between October 1918 and September 1931. Births for 2 of them are key to finding the truth of this story in my family. When I began my journey into family history and genealogy, I asked my maternal grandmother about my grandfather's parents, and she told me this story. We don't really know much about them. Your grandfather is the baby in the family. He was told his mother had his father committed to the asylum because he was in her way. Shortly after being committed, Parker committed suicide because he was distraught over losing his family, his home, his job, and for being committed. After that, Florence lined the children in front of the judge and said, "Here, take them, I don't want them." The older children tried hard to keep the family together, but the judge only allowed it for about a year, then all the children were placed into foster homes. The younger ones felt the older siblings could have done more to keep them all together and developed grudges that they passed on to their children. Wow, what a story, right? It would be more than 2 decades into my search before I tackled this story, and here's why. There were too many unknowns. I had no idea when or where this happened. I had no idea what the asylum was called or where it was located. I didn't even know when, where, or how Parker died, and by the time I was ready to investigate it further, everyone who knew something firsthand had also died. This meant I had to talk to the children of those directly affected by this event, but it also meant new versions of the story would likely be told. I quickly learned most of the details remained consistent, but other details were certainly questionable. These are the identified facts in the story. Florence and Parker were married and they had children. At some point, Florence supposedly had him committed to the asylum, and at some point he supposedly committed suicide. She then took the kids to the courthouse and told the judge to take them, and the younger children felt, well, the older ones could have done more. Since reference of something major, like the development of a town or national event such as the Gold Rush, are missing from the story, that degree of historical context is not helpful in proving points true, false, or even plausible. So what can we prove or disprove, and where do we look for those records? There is no disputing that Florence and Parker were married. They tied the knot on the 13th of July, 1918 in Somerset County, Maine. It was his second and her first marriage. Also, there's no disputing children were born during their marriage. According to birth records in the state of Maine, Parker and Florence had their children in the towns of North Anson, Hartland, and Somerset, and Skowhegan in Somerset County, Maine, between 1918 and 1931. However, rumors circulating throughout the family suggest not all of the children were Parkers, and that is definitely an entirely different presentation for another day. Birth and marriage records in New England states are available in multiple locations, and boy, how I wish all locations were more like them. I was born in Maine. My birth record is not only available from the state, but also in the town where I was born and in the town where my parents resided. Marriage records are available from the town where the ceremony took place and from the state. For the most part, this is pretty typical of most locations for marriage records. Keep in mind where vital records may be found, if at all, for locations within your family story. From here, I didn't have enough information to successfully prove or disprove the remaining points in the story, and that meant I needed to go back to the family for more information. Before I do that, let's discuss where to look for records and discuss what records might be available. Depending on when and where Parker was committed to the asylum will likely depend on whether records are still available. It's possible the records might be at the state archives or with the institution if it's still around. Could there be records at the local level? Declaring Parker of an unsigned mound and incapable of caring for himself and his family. Exactly where would something like this be handled? Would it be the local level or would that be the state level? The big question here is when and where did Parker die? Finding his death certificate may answer many questions, but it may also lead to more. It is likely that the state has his death record on file, but where would that be? Remember, the story doesn't provide locations, and Parker was an immigrant. Did he return to Canada or was he still in the US? Where did Florence take the children to the courthouse, and when did she do this? It's possible there could be papers supporting the surrender of her children, and these are likely at the county level or at the state archives if the record is too old to be with the county. But in which state and county did this happen? When I first began working on this story, I included this statement as a fact. It wasn't until many hours had been invested in the search that it occurred to me it isn't a fact at all, but rather an opinion of the children, possibly used by the grandchildren to embellish the story further. Be careful not to get too hasty in gathering the facts that you accidentally pick up an opinion or two along the way. Besides, I believe there was little the older siblings could have done, and you'll find out why as this presentation unfolds. So let's see what the family has to say and see if their knowledge helps the search. I contacted one of Harold's sons, who told me immediately after my grandfather was admitted to the asylum, he committed suicide. My dad was about 7 years old when his father died. Dad said Gram was a lady of the night. We all know what that meant, and liked her men too much to keep the kids around, so she gave them away to the state. He said she lined them up in the courtroom and told the judge, "Take them, I don't want them." If you'll notice, one difference between this cousin's version and my grandmother's version is the timing, shortly versus immediately. When I tell this story, I always ask those listening, what is your personal meaning of shortly and immediately, where a time frame is concerned? Usually, the answers are that shortly is within a couple of days to a week, and immediately is usually within hours or up to a day or two later. And we'll come back to this point in a bit. For this part of the story to be true, Parker would have died sometime between May and December of 1930 or between January and April 1931. And since Harold and his twin brother Carol were born on the 23rd of April 1923, this is plausible. However, Albert, being the youngest, was born on the 2nd of September 1931, and that meant no later than early January 1931, Florence was pregnant with him. Albert's birth makes this part of the story unlikely, but it also gives me a starting place in looking for Parker's death. Knowing that my grandfather was born in Somerset County, Maine, I decided to start my search in that state and county. I finally located Parker's death and ordered his death certificate. It's difficult to see the details here, so let's take a closer look. Here, I learned that Parker died the 31st of March, 1936, that he died at the Bangor State Hospital, where he had been for 4 years, 11 months, and 11 days, and that he died of pulmonary tuberculosis. This means Parker entered the hospital on or about the 20th of April, 1931, roughly 4.5 months before Albert was born. I already mentioned it was said Parker committed suicide shortly or immediately after being committed to the asylum. And I don't know about you, but 19 days short of 5 full years is neither shortly nor immediately. I believe Florence lied to her children so they wouldn't ask questions. I also believe she knew Parker didn't commit suicide because she never remarried until August of 1946. When I shared this discovery with my family, I was met with many criticisms. One cousin openly chastised me, saying, "Don't you know suicide was more taboo than it is now? And that doctor lied about it to protect the family?" She ended her rant with, "You're changing the family narrative." While my cousin may be right, official record states Parker's death was not a suicide. But her criticism made me wonder more about the hospital, so I researched it more specifically. This image, found at asylumprojects.org, shows the Bangor State Hospital on the sprawling 105-acre site purchased by the Maine State Legislature before 1895. This is likely the same version of the hospital Parker was committed to in 1931. Bangor State Hospital originally opened under the name Eastern Maine Insane Hospital on the 1st of July, 1901, with 640 beds. Stigma associated with the word insane prompted a name change in 1913 to Bangor State Hospital. In the 1970s, the name was changed again to Bangor Mental Health Institute. Today, this now 51-bed facility operates under the name Dorothea Dix Psychiatric Center. The discovery that the hospital still operates was encouraging because that meant finding Parker's records may be possible. What I didn't learn when researching the hospital was whether or not tuberculosis patients were treated there. After much more research, I finally found something. This image shows the layout of buildings on the property. While it's truly difficult to see, something caught my eye. In the lower right corner of the image is a separate building for tuberculosis patients. It is plausible that Parker had TB, and it's equally plausible that he died from it. A search for Parker's medical records from his stay here was unsuccessful only due to the age of records. Because his records would be older than the maximum requirement for retention, they have been destroyed. We'll never know the truth behind Parker's stay or treatment at Bangor State Hospital. Now that we have researched this portion of the story, let's see if we are able to prove that Florence gave her children away to the state. These are the known children born during the Lewis's marriage. According to their birth dates, at the time Parker was admitted to the hospital on or about the 20th of April, 1931, 3 of the children have died. Parker Jr. would have been 11. Burl and her twin brother Merle would have just turned 9. Carol and Harold were days from their 8th birthday. Freeman would have been 5. Edwin, almost 3. Percy, almost 1. And my grandpa still hadn't been born yet. Researching for information specific to Somerset County records, I discovered this explanation on their website, that the Somerset County Register of Probate Court handles estates of deceased and missing persons, guardianships, conservatorships, and legal name changes, adoptions, and other family matters dating back to 1809. This was great, but now where do I find more information? And where are the records? How do I find out if my family members even have an extant case file? Well, Family Search to the rescue. While helping another researcher with something, I stumbled upon a set of digitized records on the Family Search site. Keep in mind, I have quote unquote searched this site for countless hours looking for information. What I failed to do was browse the site for what I now call quote unquote hidden information. This is information that is there and available, but it doesn't show up in search results because the records haven't been indexed. And I found a set of records that looked promising. Do you see what I see? The fourth record set is titled Card Catalog, Children Releases, Surrenders and Complaints, Abbott, Venial Elmer to Zinkovich, John Joseph, 1929 to 1993. Could I really be this lucky? As it turns out, I was very lucky. This record set contained cards for 10 children. You're probably thinking, wait a minute. She just said we're looking for 9 children, not 10. And you're right. Edith isn't a child of Parker and Florence at all. She was born the 31st of July, 1916. Her birth record states her father was a man by the name of Frank Teresa, and she would have been 16 at the time the state sued her mother for neglect. Edith was probably back in the Lewis home in 1933 because by 1920, Parker's mother, Margaret, had adopted her, and Margaret had just died a month earlier. Shut the front door. These cards still don't tell us much, other than Florence was sued for neglect by April 1933, so I had to keep digging. I discovered through a Facebook group that the records were available through Somerset County. After 2 requests with different people and more than a year wait, I received the desired information. It is difficult to read here, but the state identified Parker as, quote, confined at Bangor State Hospital in their initial filing. The state also claimed, quote, on the first day of March, 1933, and on diverse other days and times, said minor children were willfully neglected by the said Florence J. Lewis, end quote. The court moved quickly in this case. The children were in foster homes within a couple of weeks. Each one remained in state custody until they completed high school, got married, or joined the service. Records after this one support this information. Beyond the single case file, no other records involving this case, such as orders or minutes, were found. Now, let's review the information discovered through research and compare it against the known family story. Details of this story are dependent on when Parker entered the hospital or the asylum. Was he admitted as a TB patient or committed as a psychiatric patient? We'll never know because his medical records were destroyed and a search of court cases declaring him of an unsound mind or incompetent have not been uncovered. I think why he was there depends on what you choose to believe. It is possible that Parker was committed to the asylum for psychiatric care where he committed suicide. However, it is more plausible that he was admitted for treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis contracted while residing in North Anson. Although it's possible he may have attempted suicide, it is more plausible that he did not and that he truly died from tuberculosis almost 5 years after admission for treatment. It appears the terms shortly and immediately, as used by family members in telling this story, are embellishments. Florence didn't actually make the decision to take the children to the courthouse. She was sued by the state for neglect. Could she have said to the judge, "Take them, I don't want them"? Sure, she could have. My Uncle Harold said so when he was there that day, just days shy of his 10th birthday. But remember, as a child, his perspective on the day's events were likely misunderstood, but the outcome was clear. The children would not be going home that evening, nor any other, until they reached an age or marital status satisfactory to the court. It's always important to ask many questions. Who told the story? How many different times was it told before you heard it? Did anyone telling the story have reason to embellish or twist the facts? Then ask, well, what are the facts? What records can help answer the questions I have about the story? Do records still exist? And where will I find the records? Who can access the records if I find any? How do I get copies? If you get copies, ask, did I get all of the records? Are there minutes or orders recorded separate from the case files? What answers did I get, and do I have new questions? As we open the time for questions, I invite you to join me next time as we explore the various techniques used to locate these children in the following census years, not knowing what surname they would have or where they were living at the time.
Thank you very much. We are going to ask you to go ahead and stop sharing. And we did have a couple of questions about, did you want everybody to see your notes as you were presenting?
I didn't realize they were. No, that wasn't that wasn't the plan.
Okay, just making sure of that. Okay, we do have time now for Q&A. And while you're doing your Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and send out a poll. So as you are answering the questions for the poll, go ahead and turn those in. We'll go ahead and answer questions from the audience for Denise. So do you have any questions for Denise from her presentation today? You can type them in the chat. Pam Levin says that it was an excellent presentation. Jessica says, very well done. Thank you for walking us through this. Does anybody want to ask a question? You can go ahead and ask. I was curious, while we're waiting for other people to either type in their questions or unmute and be ready to ask. I was curious, did you look in newspaper articles? I didn't catch that because I was busy working on other things to help your presentation.
I have not been able to locate newspapers for the area for that time.
I wondered because quite often things like that could be put in the social. So I wondered if that was something that you to do.
Denise, just a question for you. This is Pam. Hi.
Hello.
Did the information that you eventually found, were you able to go back to your family members and convince them that what you had found was more of a true story than the family lore?
So the answer to that is a little bit mixed. I do have some family members who are insistent that I am trying to change our family's narrative. And I have some family members who say, you know, that explains a lot. When I contacted so Harold is actually my great uncle, being my grandfather's brother. And when I contacted his son, who is the one who provided me their version of the story, he said to me, you know, that's surprising because Dad always thought that Grandpa died when he was 7. And it turns out that Parker died when Harold was 13. And so his son, Harold's son, questioned how different would his father's life have been had he known up to 13 years of age, his father was still alive.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Your story is fascinating and really great research. I loved hearing about it.
Thank you.
Freya and Stephen are asking, did you go to newspapers.com to search for any social newspaper articles?
I have tried, but for right now, I've not been able to locate newspapers in that general area, not just their little town, but just in the general area for the time. I think the timing of the event has not been easy for me to search in newspapers.
Okay. Cheryl says, great suggestions for exploring this fascinating family story. Your research will make it more interesting. We
Thank
have
you.
loved it. So interesting. Great job. And Linda Wheatley suggests, I'm very curious what happened to this wife mother. Do you know anything about her?
Yes, Florence is quite the character. She ended up living with Harold for a very short time after he married, had some children. Some of his children remember Florence. She did remarry in August of 1946 to a local man by the name of Augustus Boulay. And when she died in May of 1953, my grandmother was 4 months away from having delivered my mother. And so when I was able to go home, I currently live in Kentucky, so I was born in Maine. And so when I got to go home for the first time and research the people, before I ever really got into this story, I was able to locate her, and she is buried in a grave that Augustus owned, but he's not there. So I do know a little bit about her. She, when she arrived in this country from England, she was very pregnant with Edith, the 16-year-old from the court records. Shortly after she had Edith, within, I think, Edith in 1918, she had Aunt Winnie, who I recently discovered passed away in 1925. And then she married Parker, and they continued to build their family. There were multiple sets of twins. Part of the story of the additional presentation is that in 13 months' time, Parker had 5 children with 2 women. So yeah, there were multiple sets of twins in the family.
Wow.
I think you've hooked us all in at this point on back for the second part.
So I'm actually
fascinating.
Yes, so I'm actually this whole presentation is going to be built upon for that second part. I'm going to eliminate that invite to join me for the second part, and I'm going to be building that second part into this presentation for a collaboration with my local library for a genealogy day in July.
Awesome.
So if you're lucky in your local, you'll get to go along on that second part and learn how I found my grandfather and his siblings in the census records for 1940 and 1950. Some of them I still haven't found.
I think it would be awesome if you recorded that as well. Just take have somebody with a laptop or iPad, set it up on a Zoom account or just record onto that. That would be really cool. We'd love to feature that on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
You might want to check probate records as a comment somebody else put in the, it just says D Nord, so I can't tell who that is. Have you checked probate records?
Okay, so I honestly have not. And here's the biggest thing. For me, being able to be on site and looking myself is my preference, because I have that habit. Being a clerk at my local archives, I know how easy it is to spot something else that's relevant. And so I prefer to do it myself. The challenge is I'm about 1,300 miles away from where these records sit. And even though my family wants the information, nobody's willing to go get it. Even if I say, hey, just walk in and ask for this book, this page, this case, nobody's willing to really help. And I don't get home often enough to really do the searching myself.
There's another question that says, have the descendants of the mom taken DNA tests?
Some of them have, yes, but not enough of them. And I really, I really want to approach that, but it's not a can of worms that I'm ready to address with my family, because the other children, or some of the children are believed to be the children of Parker's brother Thomas. So I think that in some instances, the Y-DNA test will be the best. And we all know how expensive that is. And like I said, it's just not a can of worms I'm ready to open.
Okay. I have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask if there are any others to go ahead and type in. There's a couple of questions here. I wonder if back then they ever looked at other family members to take the children. Was this ever mentioned in the family lore?
No, that part of the story has never been mentioned. Uncle Harold's son did say that for a short time, Uncle Harold and the older siblings kept the kids together. And I find that hard to believe, because I know that the 1930s was a different time, but what court in what country is going to give a 10-year-old custody of their little siblings? I just don't see that happening. So being recent immigrants, there wasn't a whole lot of family that came with them. Florence had a sister who was here from England, but I find no evidence at all that anybody in the family ever had them, ever had the opportunity to try to keep them.
Okay. Joy would like to know, can you tell us a bit about the website Asylum Projects? How helpful would it be in researching other institutions?
Asylum Projects was an amazing site, because you can get in there and you can find different states. I found information on the different facilities around Maine. I never imagined that asylum research would be in my repertoire. But I did notice in looking around the site for Bangor State Hospital that it was very helpful. There are some histories of some of the ones that are there. Most of the ones that I looked at, they have histories on them, such as when were they established, if they changed names, that sort of thing, how many beds they had. So Asylum Projects was a very, very helpful site in the research of this particular story.
Awesome. There's a good to point it out that asylums house people for reasons other than mental illness. And Gaynell says that her state in the early years sometimes housed the homeless who were ill. That's very true.
Yes, and there's one here locally that also housed individuals that were committed there for alcoholism.
Yeah, that was at that time also considered. Yeah. So one last comment here is check location newspapers through Chronicling America for probate cases in legal section. It says Denord is the name here, has had good results from a distance. That is a fabulous tip. Thank you.
Yep, I've tried Chronicling America and Genealogy Bank and newspapers.com and almost every newspaper site that I can find. And I guess the location is just
a tough one.
It is a very tough one.
Okay. We're going to close out this section, and I'll give you another minute to finish the audience poll. She has stayed well within her time. She finished her presentation a few minutes early, and so she was given a little bit of extra time to do her Q&A, and she's also finished that Q&A slightly early. So there's one more comment here that says, my understanding of Y-DNA is that the brothers would have had the same DNA profile. This may not prove anything significant to your case. It's just a comment.
Right, and that's true. But if there are any mutations that we know of, that may be the giveaway, and that's what I would hope for. But I'm just not ready to open that can of worms.
And to get a mutation within that short of a distance is pretty tough to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so you literally have 3 minutes left since the time that we started. We actually started the presentation at 5:08. finished well before your 30-minute 5:38, and that means you have 3 minutes left in your to 5:48 to make any other comments or answer any other questions. And so we're going to turn off the poll in about 3 minutes. At this point, thank you for joining us. We will stay and talk for a few minutes, but we are going to stop the recording. We appreciate all the time that everyone has given us for this fascinating discussion. And if you'd like to find this later, at Genealogical Studies is our handle on YouTube. And thank you again for being with us. Genealogicalstudies.com is where you'll find the International Institute of Genealogical Studies.